Okay. So Job, main kind of thing of this book is, in one sentence, is God right? Is God right in who he is? Given all the suffering and the evil that takes place in the world, is God right? Is he wise in the way that he does things? We don't know exactly all that he's doing. And so that's what the book is about. And then how do we know? How do we know if God's right? How do we know if God's wise? Unless God tells us, because it's very difficult, as we'll see, if not impossible, to project onto God from sources of human knowledge and wisdom. Whether that's observing the world around us and trying to say something about God, or thinking internally and trying to create some framework to come up with who God is and what he's done and what he's doing, or tradition, ancient, ideas about God, or the collective experience, or philosophy. All of this comes to ultimately failure without God telling us what he's doing, right? And it's not necessarily our right to know that, but Job asks those questions. And Job does ask a question that's very common. And it's not just common in philosophy classrooms, it's common with people who are suffering. Why did God allow this terrible thing in my life, right? Or why does God allow this type of suffering? More than that, why does God allow suffering and evil? If God is good, perfect, just, and holy, and if his creation ought to reflect who he is and work the way that he is and what he prioritizes and says is good, then evil in this world becomes a problem. How does that even happen? How does God allow that? And so Job raises those questions. Now, we could also point out that this is good, but we also need more than this, that the problem of evil, if God is all good, powerful, then why is there evil in the world? Why does it persist? Why does God allow it? But the idea is, if there is sin and evil, that presupposes our knowledge and the existence of God. Because that means our ability to not just recognize suffering, that bad things happen, but to call things unjust, to call things sin, to call things evil, shows that we know the standard, we know who God is, we know what he loves, what he hates, and we can identify sin because, not just by human opinion, but because it is contrary to the nature and character of God and his law. And so that's the issue of knowing that there is sin and evil in the world actually shows that we already know that there is a God who exists and who is good. That being said, Job raises these key questions. And so we'll talk through that in the book of Job today, and also what Job's hope, Job's wish is for. But let's look at Job 1:1 and kind of see just the snapshots of Job's life. Okay, Job 1:1 says, "Now there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from evil. He said 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. His possessions were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and very many servants, and the man was the greatest man of the east." Okay, so let's just pause there for a minute. So we get this guy, it's the land of Uz, we don't know exactly where it is, but he's outside of, he's not a Hebrew, but he is a guy who loves God, fears God, walks in integrity before God, tries to please God, walks in integrity because of his relationship with God with other people, and he avoids evil. Okay, Job is a great guy. Now his name, though, Job, can mean enemy. It's like, okay, well, what does that mean? Is God his enemy? Is he an enemy? What's going on here? And so that's going to come up. Job has lots of children. Okay, they're doing well. They're blessed. They're successful. Job has a successful business. Job is the ancient Near East Walmart. Okay, that's how we need to understand him. He's like Home Depot. He's like Walmart in the sense that his wealth is measured not in necessarily money, but in, and he doesn't even mention land, but a number of employees, servants, and also number of animals. What Job is probably doing, as he's the greatest man of the East, is Job is a tradesman who he's invested in the goods like oxen, donkeys, these things, that he lends out and rents to people. And so just like you and I would go rent a U-Haul truck if you were moving, or you rent sometimes a piece of equipment to do something in your yard, people would come and rent camels and stuff from Job. And so Job is facilitating this trade. We also find out later on in Job that he gives to orphans, he gives to widows, he cares for people. He's a good guy. Okay, now there's something that people often do with the book of Job that you're not supposed to do, is they change the nature of Job. They say, okay, Job was actually not a good guy, he sins. Job did not sin. It's not that he never sinned. It's Job does not commit a sin that invites God's judgment in this direct way of his suffering. That's what you need to know. Job knows that, but he doesn't know why he's suffering. Okay, now 1:4, his sons used to hold feasts, invite their sisters, each of them on his day, so they'd have these birthday parties. Job would pray for his children. He would sacrifice on their behalf in case they turn away from God in their heart. And so Job even wants to be faithful to God down to the heart level. Okay, now Job doesn't know about this, but in Job, there is a courtroom drama. Job is a type of literature common in the ancient Near East, which is a courtroom drama. And we have these. You watch shows about courts and judges and things like this. But this one is very common where it's God's court in chapters 1 and 2. And then Job says, I want to go to court and talk to God and defend myself and show that I'm innocent. And have God state his case against me. And then God's courtroom drama with Job at the end. Okay, so Job is a lot about justice, evidence, this court style. Okay, so Job is living his life in honor of God, and it says that in 1:6, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before Yahweh. Okay, so these are angels. They are coming to present themselves, which means this is a military term, which means they're called to basically stand at attention and report to God. Okay, so even the angels, the demons, they are all ultimately reporting to God, and it says, and then Satan came among them. This is the adversary. This is the accuser. Okay, that's what Satan's name mainly means, is that even when he has been cast out of heaven, his goal is to try to thwart God. It's trying to accuse God's people, to say, God, you're just, this person's a sinner, you should kill them, you should judge them. Okay, so God actually presents Job before Satan, says, have you considered my servant Job? And Satan basically argues, God, of course Job likes you. His life is blessed when he obeys you. If you changed that, he would curse you and die. And so God says, fine, go and you can change all these things in his life. You can cause chaos in his life, but you're not allowed to touch him so that he dies. And so Job doesn't know about any of this, and that's key to the story. None of Job and his friends are able to figure out through their reasoning and their different methods, you know what, I think God was in his court in heaven, and he talked to Satan and went like this, and this is what happened. Okay, none of them are able to figure that out because God has to tell us. So now we get Job gets this bad news. Okay, listen to the hit after hit that Job takes here. Okay, Job 1:13. Now on the day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine, their oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys were feeding beside them. The Sabaeans attacked and took them. They also slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone escaped to tell you. So Job's business has now just faced disaster. It's been taken over, a bunch of people have been killed, a bunch of property has been stolen by these bandits. One guy escapes. And so Job's basically been struck in a way that the way he provides for himself and his family is now threatened pretty severely. And then he says, while he's still speaking, okay, so one person's bringing devastating news. Now another guy is going to come up and give Job some other devastating news. He says, the fire from God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have come to talk to you. So he says, look, fire came from heaven, from God, and burned up a bunch of this property. So a huge devastating blow. And then while he was still speaking, another came and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the four corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they died, and I alone escaped to come tell you. Okay, so now Job's close family members, his children have died, not just his wife, not just his parents, not a sibling, not a friend, but his children have died, and a bunch of other people probably with them. Okay, so Job mourns, which is appropriate, but listen to Job 120. It says, then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell to the ground and worshipped. So he still does praise God. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. Yahweh gave, and Yahweh has taken away. Blessed be the name of Yahweh. Through all this, Job did not sin, nor did he blame God. Okay, so he's responding rightly, but Job it's going to get more intense, and he's going to think more about this. Is this really fair for what I've done? Okay, Job 2:1. Again, Satan comes and says, okay, well, let me touch Job's body. Let me take away his health. Right? At least, people say sometimes when bad things happen to them, at least I still have my health. Well, Job's going to have that taken away. He's going to be struck with sores, boils. Imagine blisters all over your body. It says from the crown of his head to the sole of his foot, covered in these blisters. Okay? So, and it says he's scraping himself with a piece of broken pottery. Okay, to get this stuff off of him, but it can't do it. So then he's sitting in ashes mourning, and he's like, okay, he has nothing left. He's devastated. Even his wife turns on him and says, why don't you just curse God and die? You won't have to live like this anymore. And he says, you're speaking like one of the foolish women. And so he says, Job didn't sin with his lips, but the intensity now is going to cause Job to ask some questions. Then 3 of his friends show up, and they're going to be helpful at first, and they're even going to speak some truth, but they're not going to be ultimately helpful at Job, and they're not going to have the whole truth. Okay, so they come, they mourn with Job. It says in Job 2:13, they sat down on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights with no one speaking a word to him, for they saw his pain was very great. So they sat with him for 7 days straight. Okay, so that's, pretty significant. Then they start talking. Job now says, I've been thinking about some things, and he laments, and he says, I wish God never created me. I wish I was never born. Why does God create me, thrust me into this world, till I live for him, and then I sin, and then I suffer? And this doesn't seem right. This doesn't seem consistent. This doesn't seem fair. Okay. Now Job's not just complaining. Job's working off of an ancient Near Eastern concept called what we call now the retribution principle. The retribution principle. Okay, and the retribution principle is very simple, and it seems to have a surface validity to it, meaning it seems to make sense. It's just not the entire truth. The retribution principle is this. Okay, God is not random. Okay, we agree with that. God doesn't like sin. God hates sin. Okay, we agree with that too. But they say, okay, now, God, whenever there is suffering, that equals there must be guilt for sin. Because if there is suffering and there isn't guilt for sin, this is God punishing you when you don't deserve it. And that wouldn't be right, is the reasoning. Okay? So, if there is guilt for sin, there will be suffering. If you see suffering, it must mean there's guilt for sin. That's how the retribution principle works. It also works on the other side. If I do right, God rewards it. if I get a reward, I must have done something right. Okay, this is still common around the world, not so much in our country because of the influence of Christianity and other things. We do still see, there are consequences for things that we do. So this is where it gets complicated. That being said, I know some people, I have some friends who are missionaries in Cameroon and Africa. They're Bible translators. And they started translating the Old Testament because they realized we can tell people the gospel, we can tell them about Jesus, but then they just take Jesus and attach it as one of their gods. They don't understand the whole biblical worldview, that God's the only God who's the creator. And so they realized, okay, we need to create picture books to tell them the story of Genesis, tell them about this world, and then tell them why Jesus came. And so, anyway, they can't really understand, or let's say it's a big worldview shift, paradigm shift for them when they hear the story of Joseph. Because what they do is they write out like the story of Joseph in their language, and they're testing it out with the people, and they say, okay, what did he do? And they say, well, he's suffering, so he must have done something really bad, but we don't know what it is. And it's because Joseph keeps getting bad things happening to him in Genesis. And they're like, okay, this guy must be really evil, because look at all the bad stuff that's happening to him. But then when they get to the end, and it says in Genesis 50:20, it says, what you meant for evil, God meant for good, so that God can actually take evil, turn it around, and use it for good. Either people reject that because they say that doesn't make any sense, they can't get that, or they're excited about it. They're like, oh wow, I've never even heard something like that before. That you can suffer and that can be used by God in a way that isn't connected directly with your sin. Sometimes it is. But this is like in the New Testament, the disciples. They come in John 9, they see the guy who's born blind, and they say, okay, blindness is not part of God's goodness in the original creation. Therefore, it's part of the fall. That's true. And then they say, okay, well, the fall is because of sin. That's true too. But then they make a direct connection between personal suffering and personal sin, and that's not always true. They said, okay, so this blind guy who's been blind since birth, he couldn't sin before he was born. So was it his sin or his parents' sin that he was born blind? And Jesus says neither. Basically, so that Jesus could show a miracle in him and show the glory of God in that way. So they also didn't understand fully that suffering is not always connected with sin. Okay? But Job and his friends are working off of this, and Job says, well, wait a second. If I'm suffering and I didn't sin, then God is punishing me unjustly. That's what Job starts to think. And he starts to say, look, if God does, I understand God is God and he can do whatever he wants, but if that's the case, it doesn't matter if I'm good, it doesn't matter if I'm bad. Right? So Job raises these key questions. Okay, now his friends are going to debate with him, and they're going to use different methods to say, Job, you have sinned. It has to be the case that you've sinned, and here's how we're going to figure it out. Okay, so then I wrote up here, okay, the failure of human wisdom. Okay, that's what we see between the conversations of Job and his friends. None of them can get it right of what was going on and why Job is suffering. And they show in their discussions, this is the important part of the book of Job, they show in their discussions that if you push these worldviews and these ways of knowing far enough, you realize that they don't work on their own. That they can work partially, but you cannot get to knowledge of God through these things. They take the ideas of, if I look around in the world, I can project onto God, because of how the world works, who and how God is. That's kind of true, but it's not always true. Right? If I look at a rock, I can't say, okay, well, because this rock is like this, therefore God is like this. That's speculation about God. So he has his three friends, Bildad, okay? You guys know Bill Nye the Science Guy? Okay. Bildad is kind of the empiricist, the scientist who says, look, there's cause and effect in the world, Job. The effect is suffering, the cause is sin. That's how it works. Okay, there's Zophar, there's Eliphaz, These guys are historians and philosophers. Okay, so they'll use the traditions of the ancients. They'll use reason. They'll use natural theology, which is trying to look at the world around you, or logic, and trying to say, okay, if I put these logical chains of ideas together, I can say God is doing this or that, or is like this or that. Okay, so they use philosophy. But what Job, in his discussions, is one of these guys will speak, Job will answer. Then another guy will speak, Job will answer. And Job will say, well, wait a second, that doesn't work. And these guys realize, okay, that's not right. Let me change my argument. Okay, so they try to change. And then there's this guy, young guy, Elihu, who gets frustrated at the end and says, look, I was trying to respect my elders and let the older guys with more wisdom speak first. But he said, I realized in this whole discussion that just because someone's old, that doesn't mean that they're wise. He goes, now, Job, let me talk to you. And so he basically, I don't know if he insults them, is not probably the right word, but he corrects them and says, well, wait a second, just because somebody's old, been around a long time, doesn't mean that wisdom is actually with the aged. Okay, so people are generally wiser when they're older, but not always. Yeah.
Can I go to the back?
Yeah. Okay, let's look at some of these things. Okay, look at Job 4 verses 7 and 8. This is Eliphaz saying, okay, look, we can observe, we can, through our senses, how this world works, Job, and therefore, from that, we can know that God is punishing you because you've sinned. Okay, look, if Job 4, 7 and 8, he says, remember now whoever perished being innocent, or where were the upright destroyed? According to what I have seen, those who plow iniquity and those who sow trouble harvest it. Okay, so he makes kind of a good point here that is partially true. That's what's so tricky about this. Some of this is true, but it's not all true. He says, whoever perished being innocent, meaning, Job, you're a sinner too. We're all sinners. Anyone who dies, God is just to do that because of sin, right? So he says, I've observed in the world around me that those who sin, who plow iniquity, usually reap the consequences. So he says, Job, you're in the consequences, therefore you must have been sinning. And his logic makes sense. Okay, but it's not always the case. That's what the issue is here, is that we see that, yeah, people who are dumb, who sin, they often, their consequences catch up with them. You reap what you sow. That's a biblical argument. It's just not entirely always the case. That's why this is, Job is a book that's more complex. Look at Job 5:27. Job 5 is about God's justice. Okay? Job 5:27 says, behold this, we have investigated it, and so it is. Hear it and know for yourself. He says, look, Job, hear, listen, know, see, observe the world around you, and pick up on the cause and effect that's happening. But Job answers back. Look at Job 13. Job answers this in Job 13:1. Job says, hey, look, guys, you're not the only ones who've been around the block. I've seen the world too. I'm not any younger than you. I'm not any dumber than you. I have observed these things as well. And here's some things I've also observed that makes this more complicated. Listen to Job 13:1. He says, behold, my eye has seen all this. My ear has heard and understood it. What you know, I also know. I am not inferior to you, but I would speak to the Almighty and I would desire to argue with God. He says, but you smear me with lies. You're worthless physicians. And he says, oh, that you would be completely silent and that it would become wisdom. And then he says, please hear my argument. Okay? And then he says, he asks a question in Job 13:7. He says, will you speak what is unjust for God? And will you speak what is deceitful for him? Will you show partiality for him? Will you contend for God? So basically, Job is saying, look, guys, I've observed things around in life as well. I'm not any dumber than you, but you guys keep accusing me, and you have not observed my sin, but you're assuming that it's taken place. Okay, so Job points out that this just doesn't work. Okay, let's look at
Have you spoken?
Yeah. Okay, let's look at Bildad. Go to Job 8:11. Okay, this is Bildad, the science guy. Okay, and listen. Look, he basically says, Job, look, in the world, and this is true, there's cause and there's effect. Therefore, if you're experiencing suffering as the effect, cause must be sin. Right? He says, you water a plant and it grows. You don't water a plant and it withers. There are reasons why things happen, Job, and there's reasons why you're suffering. It's because of your sin. Okay, so his reasoning makes some sense, but it's not true. Okay, so Job 8:11, he says, can the papyrus grow without a marsh? Right, there's a groundwork that a papyrus grows in. Can the rushes grow without water? While it is still green and not cut down, yet it withers before any other plant. So are the paths of all who forget God, and the hope of the godless will perish. Okay, so he says, look, Job, these things don't grow without water, just like you don't suffer without sinning. Okay, so he says he's trying to get Job to confess, but Job says, I'm not guilty. I haven't done anything. Zophar, okay, the other guy, basically says, look, we can kind of study human suffering and prosperity and then say, this must be what God is doing. Go to Job 11, verses 5 and 6. He says, but would that God might speak and open his mouth against you, speaking to Job, and show you the secrets of wisdom, for sound wisdom has two sides. And know that God forgets a part of your iniquity. Can you discover the depths of God? Can you discover the limits of the Almighty? Okay, now he asks a good question. He says, I wish God would speak and show you that you're guilty, Job. Can you know what the limits of God are? Maybe God knows something you don't. But that's the problem. Zophar, Job is going to turn it around at him and says, hey, wait a second. You said maybe God knows something I don't. I don't know everything God's doing. He goes, you don't know everything God's doing. You're trying to tell me what God's doing and saying I don't know. Well, you don't know either. Okay, so they have these arguments. Job 15:17 talks about tradition and human wisdom. Okay, so it's like, okay, we've tried to observe the world around us and figure out what God's doing. We don't know everything, okay, we admit that. But let's look at the world around us, and you know what? There have been people who came before us, maybe they know more than us, and we can kind of put their ideas together. The problem with that is they say, let's argue from tradition. The problem is, something is not true because it is old, and something's not true because it's new. Right? You can have old ideas that are wrong, and you can have new ideas that are wrong. Right? So listen to Job 15:17. Okay, 15:17. He says, I will tell you, listen to me and declare, what I have seen I will also declare, what wise men have told and not concealed from their fathers. And so he basically says, I'm going to pass down the wisdom of the ancients. But Job says that isn't going to work. Okay, so listen to, go back to Job 8. Job 8 through 10. It says, please ask of past generations and establish the things searched out for by their fathers. For we are only of yesterday and know nothing, because our days on earth are a shadow. Will they not instruct you and tell you and bring forth words from their hearts? So he says, hey Job, listen up. Let's listen to our elders. They know better than us. And Job says, well, wait a second. They had limitations as well. Job 15:7 says, Job asks them, were you the first man to be born? He says, hey, look, you don't know. You haven't been around forever. Or were you brought forth before the hills? Do you hear the secret counsel of God? And do you cut down wisdom unto yourself? What do you know that we do not know? What do you understand that is not with us? Both the gray-haired and the aged are among us older than your father. So he says, hey, look, Job, we can all understand what the tradition says, but that doesn't answer the questions, or that's what Job is saying. This doesn't ultimately solve the problem. Okay, so Job and his discussions, this is the important kind of meat of the book. Job and his discussions with his friends show the failure of human wisdom. Human knowledge, human wisdom can figure some things out. There's no doubt about that. That being said, it can never figure out what God is doing, the nature of suffering, all the details that are necessary to know what God is doing, or control all those things. And so Job works systematically through each way of knowing and shows it doesn't work. Okay, so this is why Job is foundational for the Bible, because it shows why you need the Bible. Why you and I need God's Word is because we don't figure out truth about God or true wisdom or knowledge in this world without God, without Him telling us and without Him speaking to us. Okay, so go to Job 28. Go to Job 28. This is a pivotal chapter in the book. Okay, Job says at a certain point, look, there are miners who go out in the world and they can dig deep into the earth and use explosive, blow things up, and they can dig and find silver and gold. And they go way down deep. There are people who can get down. There are ocean trenches, really deep. Okay. Now, if you and I, like as our class, went out into the wash and we started panning for gold or digging, we might find some gold, but we probably wouldn't. It's possible, but it's unlikely. Okay? But Job says wisdom is not like this. He says wisdom is not like that if you dig around in the earth for it, or if you take humans and they kind of think through it, that you get to wisdom. He says it's not in the ocean trenches. It's not part of this world where you can have access to it. So for wisdom, you have to go to the source. He says that wisdom's hidden from the eyes of all living. It's not like you can go and say, okay, I'm going to exchange some gold for some wisdom. You can't buy it, can't search for it, can't dig for it. And so he finally says in Job 28:23, for wisdom you have to go to the source. God understands its way. He knows its place. For He looks to the ends of the earth and He sees everything under the heavens. Meaning God understands everything all at once. And then God is the one who's the creator. And then can somebody read Job 28:28, key verse for this book? Vivian, yep.
And he said to man, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to turn away from evil is understanding.
Okay. Job is the first one biblically to lay out this concept. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Fear of the Lord is wisdom. Turn away from evil is understanding. The rest of wisdom literature builds off of this foundation. It's said in Psalms. It's said in Proverbs. It's basically restated in Ecclesiastes. Fear God and keep His commandments. And so the fear of Job shows if you will try to apply human wisdom and knowledge, it will fail. Therefore, we need God's wisdom. And therefore, he shows here the need for revelation, the need for God's word. Job 19, 3 and 24 talk about, Job says, I wish my words were written down. I wish these issues were recorded and written down in a book forever, so that these things could ultimately be raised and that someday God can answer them. Okay? Well, Job's wish came true. His words are written down. We're reading them thousands of years later. And the rest of the Bible answers the book of Job. Is God really righteous? Is God really wise? And so Job shows this is what I call the location of wisdom. Okay, not the physical location of wisdom, but where is wisdom? It's with God. It's with the source. It's the one who's the creator, who knows how everything works, who knows everything, who is everywhere, and who is all-wise, who doesn't need advice, who doesn't need people lending to him that he can pay it back, which comes from Job as well. Okay, so, but Job goes through and shows between he and his friends, they can never figure it out. None of Job's friends say, you know what, I was thinking about it last night, and I think God was sitting in his court in heaven, and the angels were presenting themselves before him, and then God said, have you considered my servant Job? None of them figured this out, right? Because they can't unless God speaks. And so that's why we need the Bible. That's why Job is first, is because Job is an introduction to why the Bible is necessary. It raises those key issues for us so that the rest of the Bible can answer these things. Okay, let's go to Job chapter 9. Okay, turn to Job chapter 9. Another key area of the book of what Job really wants. Job is not accusing God because he wants God to admit that he's wrong. Job says, I want God to be right, and I want me to be right. And I want to be right before God. But Job is kind of thinking that his rightness before God is going to depend on something within him, just like his sin depends on something in him. So he says in Job 9, 1 and 2, he says, then Job answered, he said, in truth, I know this is so, but how can a man be in the right before God? So basically he asks the question, how can a person who's a sinner, who's a creature, be right before a holy God who's a transcendent great creator? Job says, I'm terrified to approach God. I could never go to God. I couldn't get a hold of him. He goes, and by the way, even if I could somehow get into the courtroom before God, I know his greatness would terrify me into silence. That I wouldn't really be able to present my case before God. Listen to Job 9:3. If one wished to dispute with him, meaning bring God into a legal argument, he could not answer him once in 1,000 times. Meaning God would out-argue every time just by who he is. And he says, look, nobody's able to basically approach God like this. He's the one who's creator and upholder of all things and the judge. And so basically Job says, I need someone actually that I can go in and answer God. And choose, he says in 9:15, how then can I answer him? And choose my words before him. He says, for though I were right, I could not answer. And I would have to implore the mercy of my judge. So he says, basically, even if what I'm saying is true in a sense, I really can't make God answer and accountable to me. Okay, so he says, I would just have to throw myself on the mercy of God. Now, what does Job, he now wishes, he goes, you know what I really need? I need I need God to be on my side so I can approach God. That's what he says. But I also need somebody who can sympathize with me, who can get what I go through as a human being who needs to approach God but is afraid. Okay, so can somebody read Job 9, 32 and 33? I think we read this a little bit yesterday. Job 9, 32, 33. Yeah, Eli?
For he is not a man as I am, that I might answer him. Though we should come to trial together, there is no arbiter between us who might lay his hand on us both. Okay,
so he says, look, the problem with me approaching God is he's not a man that I can give him my answer, that I can defend myself in front of him. And he says, the only one who can bring me before God is God. And he says, but God's the judge. He goes, so he says, Job, what he starts to wish for in Job 9:33 is what? What does Job start to ask? He says, you know what I would really need to approach God is what? Look at Job 9:33. There is no what between us.
Arbiter?
There's no arbiter. There's no mediator.
Oh.
There's no umpire, right? So it's an arbiter is someone who you sit down with when, like, if you and your friend or like business partner had like a legal dispute. The arbiter is somebody who sits down and works with both of you to come to a solution. Okay, so what Job is saying is, I want a mediator who can put his hand on God, who can be equal in nature and status to God, who's not afraid to approach him, who can put his hand on God, but who can also empathize and put his hand on me. Okay, so Job wants a God-man mediator so that he can bring him before God and argue Job's case and make Job righteous before God. Okay, so Job is key book for justification, for what it means to be right with God and right before him. So he asks this question, how can a man be right before God? There's no mediator between us. So Job says what we need is a mediator. We need a messianic mediator who's God and man to bring God and I together and to make me right in the eyes of God. Okay, so Job introduces the need for a mediator. Okay, now Job also, go to Job chapter 19. I'm going to read something from Job 14. Job says, I wish I was dead because then maybe God would leave me alone. Okay, that's what his argument is. It's not totally right. Job gets very raw in these areas, but he says, look, I just wish in Sheol, in the place of death, that I might have some peace from the suffering that God has allowed into my life. And that maybe God, if he finally just killed me, that maybe God would be done with me and I wouldn't have to deal with this suffering for whatever reason it's happening. Okay? So Job is, arguably suicidally depressed. But listen to Job 14:10, where he talks about the nature of death here. And he says, but a man dies and lays prostrate, a man expires, where is he? He says, as water evaporates from the sea and the river dries up from the parched land, so a man dies and does not rise. Meaning you die and you stay dead. Until the heavens are no longer, he will not awake nor be aroused out of his sleep. So he says people die, they stay dead, and until the heavens are removed by God, that he doesn't come back to life. He says, he's asking God, that you would hide me in Sheol, the place of death, that you would conceal me until your wrath returns to you. Basically, that your wrath on me would be done, that you would set a limit for me and remember me. Job 14:14, if a man dies, will he live again? All the days of my struggle I will wait until my change comes. Okay, so he says, look, I'm going to die, but is there a hope that I could live again? I know that people die and they stay dead, but could God do something else? Can somebody read Job 19:25 through 26? Job 19:25 through 26. Yeah, Abigail.
25 through 26.
Yes.
For I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been thus destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God. Okay.
So Job says, and we have songs, hymns about this, he says, I know that my Redeemer, the mediator I asked for, and he knows God is his Redeemer as well. He says, I know my Redeemer lives. I know God is the living God. And then he says, and at the last, he will stand on the earth. So he says, I know God is my Redeemer. He is alive. And that someday God is going to stand here on the earth. And then Job says, even after I die and I rot away and my skin is destroyed, he says, yet from my flesh, meaning in my body, I will see God. And so basically he says, whom I myself shall behold, and whom my eyes will see and not another. Okay, so he says, would know that God could make everything right and be righteous and wise if God could overcome death, make me right before him, and raise me from the dead. Okay, so Job recognizes not only the need for justification, the need for a mediator, but the need for resurrection from the dead. Okay, so let's put this all together real quick as we finish up here. Okay, Job, by the way, doesn't get the answer. God says, hey, look, I'm God. You cannot be God. But Job, is there a possibility that in me being God, I know something that you don't? Job says, you're right. I can't. I cover my mouth. I repent in dust and ashes. God restores him, but Job doesn't get the answer, arguably until Job dies, and then he does see that God did have a plan. But let's put this all together. Job sees all our ways of knowing what God is up to fail. We need God to speak. We need God to reveal wisdom. Job says, I want to be right before God, but I am a creature, I'm a sinner, I can't approach God, God's too great for me to approach him. Therefore, I need a mediator who can put his hand on God and his hand on me, and that can bring me into right relationship with God, that I can be declared righteous before God, and I need resurrection from the dead. Right? That after I die, if God could overcome death, I know he would make it all right in the end, in his judgment. So what we've got here is basically Job's wish and hope for the gospel. Right? Job sets up the desire and the wish, and the sad thing about Job is he says, but I never know if any of this could be true or if God is really going to do any of it. Okay? But the difference is, with us, is we actually know God did do this. God did send Jesus as the mediator between God and man. Jesus did die for our sins and was raised for our justification. We can be right before God. Jesus' resurrection proves that, right? And that he will come in judgment. He will raise, there will be a resurrection of the dead and a final judgment. And so Job's desire for God making all things right, he says, if God would do all this, I know he would be true and right and wise. And the rest of the Bible says God did do this. Right? So the book of Romans shows, yep, God is wise. God is righteous. And he proves it through sending Christ. Right? And so Job is so key because it shows us not only the Bible, but why we need the Bible. Okay, it shows us what needs to happen in the Bible. What does God need to do? What does he need to answer? And so Job, probably he didn't figure this out until he died. It's not just that he got his stuff back. It's that when he died, he did see God. He did know the plan. He did see that God was working this whole time in a way that Job wasn't aware of because Job didn't have revelation. He didn't know Jesus. But we do know Jesus, and that's what James says in James 5:11. He says, look, Job endured, and he didn't know what God was going to ultimately do. He says, we can endure because we've seen the outcome of what Job was wishing for. We've seen the goal, and we have the rest of the Bible. We know that God sent Jesus, therefore we can have that hope. So Job is a key book. Hopefully we can raise it to its place of full appreciation in the church again, and people understanding exactly what this book contributes. But we've got to end that.